Cool. I'll take POIs in chat. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In general, we make the observation that the EU has ceded a large portion of the handling of refugee status to border countries like Spain and its border with the Maghreb and Greece and Bulgaria, in other examples, for example. These countries have made the choice to tighten border control and turn away many people at the border. We say that's generally a bad thing, and we also say that it's the responsibility of the EU as a whole to take on the control of its external borders. There are quite a few problems in the sense that these countries are harmed by the burden of taking on the refugees, and the refugees themselves live substantially worse lives due to the decreased support offered by countries on the external borders of the European Union. We instead envision a host of robust expansionary policies to accommodate these refugees, like the policing of refugee camps, the compensation for costs incurred in existing settlements, and the distribution of refugee camps equally between member states. We suspect this to be a likely policy that the EU will implement, one, because it's an extension of existing EU policy, but two, because it's a natural and most efficient way to deal with these things, for the reason that clearly the EU doesn't want to be dealing with poverty and healthcare crises across the border, but beyond that, it's probably the most effective way of handling the problem. So just before I move on to the argument, just some preemptive framing to what I suspect may be the most potent argument from OP, which is that there will probably be a partial resting of resting as in taking away of sovereignty of border control. As in, there will always be some anger and some anti-immigrant sentiment on either side. We suspect this gets better on our side. One, because the external countries on the border are no longer solely bearing the cost and burden of it. We suspect that the instantiated felt cost on the average individual on these countries is far less because it's spread across far more different countries. Even if they take marginally more refugees, the difference is that the division of cost in taxes is far less for each individual person. Beyond that, we also imagine that there will be a broad increase in anti-immigrant sentiment, given that the reaction that countries take, given that assuming that they would be allowed to take control or sovereignty of their own borders, is that they will tighten border control. The problem is that this doesn't actually stop immigration. It just means that anti-immigrant sentiment gets worse for the reason that the people don't stop trying to escape the suffering endemic to their home country. Now they're forced to go through back alley channels, commit crimes in order to get there. Not only is the experience of these individual refugees far worse, as they are far more likely to experience justice at the hands of the smugglers and the terrible circumstances that they go through, they're also far more likely to be profiled as criminals, not contributing more productively to the economy, which means that things get far worse for the treatment of refugees. So framing out of the way, I'll take POI from closing opposition.
Yeah, so what's the incentive structure as to why countries like Germany are going to accept refugees rather than just massively crack down on them so they don't get distributed to them?
That's in my first argument, subpoint 4. First argument, one way or not, this is a shared burden. We think that the shared burden is principally that the EU is principally responsible for this. First point, the EU has made an explicit commitment towards the principles of justice, fairness, human dignity, and freedom. Part of this base responsibility is to allocate towards those in exceedingly vulnerable positions who have no home or life to turn to. That is to say, many of these refugees come from war-torn countries, come from places that they would rather not return to, and that they themselves, since they are already at the border, live in a place where they have no home, no livelihood, and no future but the EU. Second subpoint, beyond that, border countries take a disproportionate amount of the burden and responsibility. One, they're forced to pay for border patrols and do other things in order to keep the security around the border maintained. Secondly, they're forced to do things like build refugee camps and processing centers and bear the healthcare costs for these refugees. But thirdly, is because of the fact that they're forced to deal with the social unrest of having to deal with these people inside the country, and they're forced to deal with their voters getting mad about these things. Third subpoint, problem, the EU is the cause for these things for 4 separate principal points. The first is that the EU is the cause. Many people might migrate to the EU as a choice in the first place instead of going south, instead of going west, for the reason that many of the benefits offered by the EU as a whole, such as the stability and peace, are created and sustained by the EU as a whole, not just the individual border country. Secondly, we also think that the EU is an integrated economic union, so the shockwave effect by diverting trade and resources away from many of the border countries that are outside of the EU affected the refugee crisis and contributed to it, making it such that they couldn't stay in the countries proximate to the EU. Thirdly, not to mention many of the colonial responsibilities taken on by non-border countries such as France, Belgium, and Sweden indirectly contributed to the destruction that many of the countries that had these refugee crises in the first place faced. Fourthly, beyond that, the external countries are simply part of the external border countries are simply part of a broader collective of internet-connected nations that share this responsibility and sovereignty, at least partially. We then identify a problem, which is that we suspect the principal responsibility is not being distributed equitably. We suspect that this should be principally solved. Beyond that, though, we also think there's a good self-interest in increasing the amount of people that can enter this. So here's where I respond to the POI directly. There are 4 reasons for why countries like Sweden and Germany would vote for more things like this. 1, countries still benefit super heavily from staying in the EU, so they're willing to make this concession, even if it means that they pay pay slightly more in taxes because they still get a lot more from staying in the economic linkages of the EU. Secondly, many countries are facing a demographic winter right now due to declining population growth and would heavily benefit from the addition of labor. For this reason, they would massively benefit from having an increased tax base as well as more people they could train because of the fact that they don't want to deal with the declining birth rates in their own country. Thirdly, it's seen as an easy to do, good PR move because of the fact that many of the things will still be offloaded to the general EU structure as opposed to the individual country, which means that it's not that large of a cost compared to the political benefit you would gain as an individual politician. But fourthly and lastly is that they're also scared of the risk of having to bail out the external border country already. Look at many of the countries that they do have to deal with, like Greece, Spain, and Bulgaria. They're already quite at risk of having to be bailed out by the European Union. Like, we suspect that it would be quite good for these countries to alleviate these economic worries, since these economic worries will be endemic no matter what. So we think it would be quite good if they could alleviate these things by taking full responsibility for the cost of these refugees. Conclusion: first, it's better for everyone, but secondly, it's better particularly for the principal allocation of responsibilities in the European Union. We're winning on this clash. I mean, I hope it's a clash. If it's not a clash by the end of the round, we're kind of screwed. Second argument: why do things get better for refugees? Four things. First of all, one of the biggest hurdles for border countries to allow people to enter into the country is simply that they don't want to take on the costs. They feel like it's unfair for the reason that they're the ones doing it. They're the ones having to pay for these camps. They're the ones having to set these up, and they're the ones that have to like face the, I don't know, like the myths of increased crime and like, I guess I don't know, other stuff, right? We suspect that three benefits arise on our side. So first of all, more refugees get accepted on our side. This is by construction of the principled argument, but it's a natural principle. It's a natural pragmatic conclusion to the argument. The second thing, though, is that less refugees have to go through illegal, horrific processes in order to stay alive, in order to stay outside of their country. So aside from the fact that more refugees get out of the country, the process itself of migration and the process itself of going to these countries is far safer and far stabler for these people. But thirdly, is that the treatment of refugees gets better in general. We think this happens for two sub-reasons, which came out in framing, but then we'll weaponize in material. First of all, is that people no longer think it's unfair for the reason that these refugees are getting distributed and shuttled off to other countries more equitably. Beyond that, though, we also think it's fair because of the fact that people face less of an individual burden on themselves for the reason that they're paying less taxes for these individuals. Why are arguments the most important in this round? So framing for the entire chunk of stuff we've given. The first thing is that we've identified these people are the most vulnerable in this debate. Again, they are people escaping the shockwaves of their home country. They have nowhere left to return, and we substantially improve the quality of life that these people face. Additionally, we provided the precise mechanism by which we can specifically help these people, as well as spread the principled responsibility. We're substantially more likely to get a robust economic policy that can accommodate these people and make their lives better. At the end of this speech, we are simply winning. I can't compare us to any team yet, but pre-compare everyone else because the conclusions are so good that like you immediately have to compare them in your head as a judge to the other teams. I guess propose.
Great. I thank that speaker for that speech. Now to open up our bench, I call upon the LO here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, quite clearly.
Strong. Cool, give me one sec. Right, cool. I'll take POIs exclusively in the chat, please. Oh dear. Cool. Okay. That PM spoke very quickly, but essentially the case just boils down to the EU has a principled obligation towards certain refugees and letting them in. The problem is that this principle is entirely outcome contingent if we prove that the life for refugees gets significantly worse on our side of the house, both because you're unlikely to get an accommodating policy, but because even in the cases where you feed massive amounts of nationalism, then we basically win. That's going to be the primary amount of my case. Before that, I am going to make the principle of sovereignty as was predicted. But the one response that I would say to them before I get into it is to just say, I don't know why their problems can't be solved by just giving Italy or Greece more funding with which to deal with refugees and not explicitly have these strong borders in this way determined by the EU. And they need to prove a difference there, and I'm not sure if they can. Cool. On the principle, I think there are three reasons as to why we should actually let these countries determine their own borders. Firstly, I think there's a reciprocity element here, which is to say that the EU takes certain control from you in exchange for certain benefits that have already been agreed to in the previously. Let's say that you allow, open borders internally in the EU in order to get the benefits of like economic integration. The problem here is it's unclear as to why this actually happens and why countries should actually give up control of their external borders overall. But secondly, I think there's a consent type claim here. That's to say, every single thing that the EU has done previously has been consented into by things such as treaties, etc., which in general have had referendums overall. I think that if you were to actually have a referendum in Spain or Greece or any of these countries asking people whether they were fine with this policy, they would obviously vote against it. Like, this is their revealed preference quite clearly. The example here is the fact that Vox, which is like an anti-refugee party, is going to form a government in Madrid at the moment. So literally their revealed preference is for this not to happen. And I'm not sure why we as debaters can supersede that preference overall. Lastly, I would observe it's probably a unique imposition on some countries because it only affects countries at the periphery of the EU rather than other ones. So I think principally this doesn't really work. But secondly, let's just engage their best case and think about what this EU policy is going to look like. I think there are two likely cases. The first is a more extreme, like anti-refugee policy, and I think that's probably the most likely case I'm going to prove. But I'm also going to take opening government at their very best and say that even if the refugee policy does become more accommodating, why that's actually likely to be bad. So firstly then on why the policy probably won't be accommodating. The framing here is that the way that the EU works is via building consensus from all of its members, which means that it requires unanimity. Sorry, I muted myself. What I was saying was, you don't just pass things in the EU by passing by a simple majority. What you do is you actually need every single person to come on board in places like the EU Council, etc. And each country has a representative on this. I think crucially what that means then is that on these issues, the countries which have the nationalist populist governments are going to actually put their foot down and ensure that the policy is incredibly not accommodating. This is countries like Hungary, it's countries like Poland. Why is this likely to be true? Firstly, because refugees are otherwise under status quo. Let's say that Law and Justice Party literally campaigned on a platform for allowing 0 refugees into Poland in their most recent election. I think what that proves is that actually it's very hard for them to then go back on their campaign promise by allowing this accommodating version. But secondly, I think oftentimes these leaders present themselves as strongmen, defending themselves like the integrity of their country and its borders against the marauding external forces. This is what we see with people like Orban, etc., which means it's in their interest to oppose an accommodating refugee policy. Thirdly, I think oftentimes these countries are able to collectivize. We see this at the moment where Poland and Hungary vote together on many issues and essentially have an effective veto to ensure that things like the EU's LGBT policy, etc., doesn't really apply to them. I think that's likely to happen with this refugee policy as well. But fourthly, I think that actually this is more true for countries which lack contact with refugees, because then they haven't even had any exposure to the massive benefits which refugees bring, which means they're more willing to be more extreme, etc. So all this goes to show that countries are likely to collectivize against having an accommodating refugee policy. The problem, though, is that when this happens and the refugee policy becomes EU-wide, that's likely to be a lot worse. Why is this true? Because on our side of the house, when there are individual countries who might be more accommodating for refugees. So for instance, Scandinavian countries, at the very least, they can take in more refugees, even if the rest of the EU is like nationalist, populist, and shitty. On their side of the house, though, you can't even get this, right? Because the way that the EU works is that laws are applied uniformly, and so every single country is beholden to this. On their side of the house, this becomes a competency of the EU rather than individual national governments. So if it's the case that the policy overall becomes conservative, that applies to even the more liberal countries overall, which means that they actually even reduce the one safe haven that refugees actually have if you buy this material in the first place. I think what that means then is, on all likelihood, refugee policies like to be significantly worse, and even the countries that were accommodating for refugees no longer definitionally are able to do so, because you can't have inconsistent policy across the EU, both by definition and because this looks incredibly problematic. Before I engage in the best case scenario, even if the refugee policy is accommodating, closing POI.
I'm going to give you a chance to actually prove your case. Why does sovereignty exist, and under what circumstances does the EU take away sovereignty in the status quo?
Yeah, like I said, it's pretty clearly a reciprocal relation, which doesn't exist in these cases. I'm pretty sure I went over that. Cool, fine. Suppose that the refugee policy is actually accommodating. I think that this still is likely to lead to increased nationalism and like a bunch of problematic impacts. Why not? Why do they say that this won't happen? Their reason for this is economic self-interest, but I don't think that nationalism operates on the basis of economic self-interest, right? I think more often it's about like defending the integrity of your country or fears of cultural alienation. Literally, people's revealed preference is to like prioritize prioritize these forces over economic things, CF Brexit or CF voting for people like national populist parties, etc. I think the point here is that these voters don't necessarily vote primarily based on these economic forces, as they say, and instead this is going to likely be exploited by far-right groups. I think that this is an existential threat to these countries, both for refugees and for everyone else living in them. The revealed preference, like the example of how this happened was in Germany, when they literally had an accommodating refugee policy that massively fed into the rise of the AfD, and it meant that Merkel had to shift right to prevent this, which meant that Germany stopped being pro-refugee. That's probably likely to happen now, but on an entirely EU-wide scale, which is incredibly problematic. Why is this likely to be true? Firstly, because to some extent, these groups already have existing support, which means this is likely to be a tipping point to ensure they can actually gain power overall. This looks like Marine Le Pen or Salvini or whoever gaining power. Why is this a massive harm? Firstly, I think it leads to things like, for the refugees themselves, increased hate crimes against them, because literally there are people who think that they are like entering their country essentially for really problematic reasons, which mean they're going to likely retaliate. But even if the hate crime isn't specific, I think that leads to broader fears about not even wanting to exist in the public sphere, because you're always worried you're going to be shut down by these extreme right-wing groups. But thirdly, I think it is actually a legitimate impact in this debate to say that this is likely to feed rising Euroscepticism, because insofar as the EU is now taking control of borders, which is what people vote on in a large degree of ways, I think that's likely to mean that people are more willing to go against the EU. So even in their best case scenario, even if the refugees are accommodated, both the livelihood of those refugees in the EU, but also the status of these countries is likely harmed. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Great. I thank that speaker for that fine speech, and I'll call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hello everyone, my name is Luigi. Preferred gender pronouns he, him, they. If you have any POIs, you can raise it in the chat. I'm gonna watch the chat for all your POIs. Okay. Alright, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, and go. 3 things I'm going to do in this speech. Number 1, I'm going to respond to the counter model of the opposition. Number 2, I'm going to talk about acceptance of refugees. And number 3, I'm going to talk about why this is the best opportunity for the EU to stabilize a centralized refugee resettlement program as opposed to a decentralized one. Number 1, on the counter model. So I want to be very clear. There is a contradiction in the opening opposition case, and this is damning against them. They say that there is a revealed preference towards the safety of these refugees, but at the same time that there are many incentives for many different internal countries because of right-wing populism reasons and because of anti-immigrant sentiments to continuously reject them, and that is continuously worse. For these reasons, I think it is significantly difficult for them to also say and be consistent with a model of continuously being willing to fund Greece and Italy and being willing to give them more money and then just saying that it can be your responsibility and can stop there, when the vast majority of migrants that are entering into Italy and Greece don't just want to stay in Italy and Greece, they also want to go to higher income countries within the EU, go to the UK, go to other places, go to Poland, go to Norway and Sweden, etc., or even to Germany, which has also historically accepted a lot of refugees before. For these reasons, the refugee crisis is inevitable. It happens and is driven by many push and pull factors for a variety of reasons that is without our prediction and without our control. And for these reasons, we say that there is a moral obligation for the EU to take that stronger responsibility because of the fact that they have benefited from their exclusiveness. They have benefited from a shared common currency. They have benefited from the ability for them to have specific exclusive trade ties that have created insiders and outsiders that has disenfranchised many Middle Eastern countries from their inability to access these systems. They have also disenfranchised Turkey in particular because of their inability to accept them into the EU, but has also continuously had to take in the brunt of this burden for a vast majority of cases. Now, I do agree, you can try and make other alternative programs, but the EU full responsibility is the only best way to shoulder the entire cost. No, thank you. I want to give additional reasons as to why a model of giving Italy and Greece more money is just not enough and why full responsibility is the only thing you can accept. 3 things. Number 1, there's limited land in Italy and Greece. There are overlapping border, and there are overwhelming border control measures within these places, and there are limited political will, especially when in the instant and immediate entrances of of many of these migrants, such as what happened in 2015 and 2016, when there were several thousands of hundreds of undocumented migrants that came in from Turkey that were not tracked and were not transparently affiliated and also communicated to Greece. That is exactly what drove the right-wing populism even worse and even harder, especially when it was not centralized, especially when not controlled, especially when there was no proper resettlement program that was done with economic incentives that could also allow these countries to also buy in to this policy. And I think the best way to do this is also through the EU, because they have the fund, they have the ECB, they have other controls over the treasuries of different nations with eternally within it. And the buy-in to the EU is contingent on this process, and that is why unanimity is more often than not present. The second response I want to make is that this gets the best interest of other countries involved, and this is where I respond to Norway and Sweden. Now usually they're the hesitant people. They're the ones who are often they don't have the buy-in to give in and pay this money because they're not mostly affected. Like, for example, the coronavirus stimulus package, they were not willing to buy in and expand the package to a larger $1 trillion fund, but they still accepted that fund because they knew that the still over cost that came into these countries is also contingent on a refugee crisis being stabilized at Italy and Greece early on, and that is why they are more likely to buy into this policy, especially because of the economic reasons that David brought to you, like the demographic winter in many of these places, and that is why there are economic incentives for them to accept refugees in the future. The last reason is on Hungary and Poland, and if there are right-wing sentiments in these countries. We ease the burden on these countries as well for the following reasons. Number one, they are not the only proximate border countries that will accept them. You can also have France and Germany also accepting at the same time because they are also part and sharing the cost, because they're not the only ones literally beside Italy and Greece, and you can also ask Austria to accept some of them. Number two, the EU is shouldering most of these costs because other richer, higher income countries are also more willing to buy in because of the economic incentives I brought to you earlier. But lastly, they have incentives to stay in the EU because they want to be part of the common currency and the common border and the common trade. For these reasons, I think there are lots of buy-in from even right-wing populist countries, and where it is harder to do so otherwise. On EU acceptance, and just internally within these countries, I think it's very, very easy for us to believe that the acceptance is likely in the vast majority of cases, even if there's some sentiment against them in Hungary and Poland. So number one, most of the governments within the EU are centrist or are liberal democratic in general. Number two, most of them have high education and more often than not have high investments towards the socialization towards a lot of minority groups, especially because many of them are also diversifying and in their own extent relatively to other nations. And lastly, because the social stigma that they will experience compared to other individuals when they feel that they are being more racist towards other people makes them even more internalize the fact that they're like to believe that they are exceptional, they want to help other people, and that's why this is something that allows them to accept and have more political will and capital to accept these people. I'm gonna go into the other argument now, but let's go closing up.
Why do the people of Croatia or Romania have a moral obligation to save these people ahead of maybe developing their own states first?
To be honest though, Croatia and the Eastern European countries that are going to be putting money into the EU, they don't pay the most anyways. So I think they won't they will accept some refugees that to the willing that they can, and obviously they have incentives to do so because those are the countries with the highest mortalities, the highest migration that's leaving these countries, and they have a lot of population reasons to accept these people. Also, I think there are many demographic reasons actually. Why is this the best opportunity for the EU to stabilize a centralized refugee settlement program as opposed to a decentralized one? Let me just dump at the end of my speech just for fun. Number one, Mario Draghi is the new Italian Prime Minister in Italy, and this is good because he's a centrist pro-EU individual. Like, he was the person that was a former ECB commissioner under the 2008 financial crisis, which led to the recovery in the EU. He's a better negotiator. He was also willing to compromise with other nations, and he also is willing to accept an EU stimulus package that was complementary with the Italian government, especially if it's accepting other refugees at the same time. Number two, Norway, Sweden, and Nordic countries that are hesitant to spend less on this have a precondition of them to stay in because of the spillover risks to other countries or to themselves if this crisis cannot be averted within Italy and Greece. And number three, Erdogan in particular is willing to coordinate and cooperate now at the best time because he's at his weakest, because it's more transparent in allowing EU observers to go into Turkey and watch the transfer process of undocumented migrants, because right now the lira is declining because of COVID, or also because Erdogan wants to satisfy his local population because he doesn't want the refugees from Iran and Syria to constantly populate the place and offset the refugee costs. For these reasons, there are many regional reasons for the EU to take this mantle and full responsibility. I'm very proud to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker for that speech. And now to close top half, called the DLO. Here.
Okay. PYs in the chat, please. And I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things I want to do. Firstly, some characterization and framing. Then I'm going to look at the multitude of scenarios that could exist in this debate and why both of them actually don't work for the government bench. And then I'm going to deal with some principles. Okay. I think the first thing I want to observe is that I think the government kind of, frankly, is living in a bit of a delusion. They sort of assert a number of incentives that kind of really belie the status quo and how countries in the European Union have acted time and time again. And, you know, if they have not solved, you know, these issues to date, it's unclear why this policy will. But let's break that down on a bit more of a granular level. Okay. I can't see why a good and significant portion, maybe not the entire of the opening government case, but a lot of it can't be solved by just giving border states a little bit more funding in order to accept refugees. Because if opening government can fiat that the means of implementing their policy is maybe forcing a few more refugee intakes and more funding, we obviously have equal political capital to do this as well, sans imposing control, right? We therefore co-opt a huge chunk of their benefit with none of their harms. So opening government's response, calling us contradictory here, did not really understand the nuance of this fiat response. Here's the thing though, I don't think they can fiat pro-refugee policy because the topic is taking full responsibility. And as our closing opposition points out, you need to analyze the incentives of the states and how they are likely to engage with this. And this brings me to our framing, and I think the beauty of our case. It literally does not matter which scenario you believe, both work for us. If you believe that the European Union will act in a way that is significantly more pro-refugee, it encourages probably significantly worse harms. That is, rising tides of nationalism, more people leaving the EU, and those sorts of things which in the long run probably don't result in policies that might actually be constructive. But if you think that the EU is likely to act more in the way that we characterize, then you simply do not solve the problem. And in fact, you probably make it comparatively worse. Either scenario, we get worse outcomes. That is the beauty of our case. Let's dive into those scenarios in a bit more detail. We think scenario 1 is probably the most plausible, which is that the EU acts in a way that is actually more anti-refugee than what opening government want to contend. And this was for 3 reasons. Firstly, empirically, this has largely been the case. Just see, for example, the attitudes towards refugee intake that a lot of countries have demonstrated thus far. See the types of governments that have been elected in Europe, for the last number of years, right-wing governments in Germany. The fact is that, for example, you've got the Brothers of Italy, an extremely right-wing party, becoming more and more popular, right? And empirically also, Europe and the EU is kind of done around consensus decision-making. That is, you don't necessarily just make a vote and then that is imposed on all other states. You can't ignore those states. Necessarily, that means you probably have to capture their views in some ways. But even if you don't believe that, there are 2 structural reasons why you'd probably not have extremely pro-refugee policy. The first is because you probably just want to ward off the harms that would be disastrous for your union, such as the fact that people recognize the growing tide of nationalism that exists in those states, but also the prospect of states leaving. You probably don't want to risk that Hungary goes and leaves you, or Greece goes and leaves you, and so on. And thirdly, you don't want spillover to your states. If you are Germany, you do not want to encourage Italy to take a drastic increased number of refugees that might eventually have to move over to your state. And opening government's response to this is just to say, but they deal with that spillover risk now already. Yeah, but it's comparative, guys. Obviously, if you're now forcing Italy to take more refugees, more of them on balance are likely to come over to you. So numbers game. The trade-off is, yes, we concede refugee intakes have not been perfect in these countries. They can certainly be improved, but to the extent that you probably have to have some uniformity in the refugee policy across the EU, that means aggressively more pro-refugee countries are unlikely to be able to do that now to the same extent because, again, of that uniformity that is encouraged. So you lose out on that benefit. Again, opening government's only mech here is like, but people will come to the table and not have these anti-refugee sentiments because it's seen as helping, we're giving them money. Again, one, it's contingent on doing it in a certain way. That's kind of circular. You probably don't get those benefits. So that is one very plausible scenario. You probably don't get any of the harms. At a minimum, right? You don't get a drastic improvement. Probably it gets worse, but you just piss off a lot of people in the process, yeah? Let's though play their game. Let's play their game. They are more refugee, they're friendly, they're telling Germany and Hungary and all the states now, you have to take more refugees. And also you have to fork out a lot more money to pay for them now. Okay, this will be a massive fucking issue. And this is for 3 reasons. The first is just empirically look at the way that this issue has kind of been discussed in the context of political discourse in the EU thus far. Also, like, refugees are unfortunately very easy to otherize, and they're also very easy to weaponize. The fact is, you can say like, they have come here illegally, they haven't, filled out the proper paperwork. This is distinct and in contrast to people who go through more traditional means of immigration, right? And the harms of this are pretty significant. One, you're just likely to increase the tide of nationalism in these countries. And this not only hurts refugees that might already come over, but like every other fucking racial group that now is like associated or, people think is a refugee, but also you're likely to significantly encourage countries to leave the EU. Now, I know everyone makes an argument like, what is the tipping point of leaving the EU? I think this will probably fucking be it, right? At the point in which this is hugely like one of the most divisive issues that actually exists within these contexts. Before I continue though, I'll take OG actually. Yep.
So your argument's benefits rely on pro-refugee countries acting on their own to help refugees. My suspicion is that if they exist, surely they can also participate in the consensus building of policies.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, they will get drowned out probably by a lot of, you can't, it's really hard for you to explain why you reach this like perfect equilibrium. If you've got like really pro-refugee countries and very anti ones and they kind of come together, then you're not really achieving much of a tipping point, unfortunately. It's probably bad if the EU disintegrates at the point which economic and diplomatic integration is good. Okay, opening government's principle is you've caused harm, colonialism, etc., etc. 1, not all countries have participated in this. 2, fulfilling your principle is somewhat contingent on better outcomes. We say 4 things though. First, because CG will probably do a principle. 1, I think you've already had a revealed preference beyond just so yes, they have you can move immigrants between your borders, right? But the revealed preference is to not extend this to people outside. Secondly, there's a degree of reciprocity. So people within the EU kind of give back to each other. That's why you're okay with Greece and Italy kind of moving between each other. Thirdly, this is a pretty unique imposition and a pretty significant economic burden at the extent that a lot of countries are developing themselves. So there's just a huge raft of reasons why this is particularly significant. But again, you don't solve the problem. Either scenario is kind of fucked. So very proud to oppose.
Great. I thank that speaker for that speech. And now to open up the back half of this debate, I call upon the member of government. Hear, hear.
Please use the chat for POIs. I'm reading a bunch of things in the speech. Firstly, a lot of characterization about what refugee policy looks like under the status quo. Secondly, about why the EU has a right to take control. Thirdly, about why policy control and control over flows is something that's very important. And then finally weighing in on the populism clash. On to framing. I think that a really important thing that's going to wipe out top half is that there's already an EU resettlement scheme that exists under the status quo, which aims to have quotas of helping countries like Hungary that ultimately exist. Therefore, I think that the much larger comparative in this debate is not, are we going to try and help Hungary with the refugee flows, although we agree with OG that there is too much of a burden on border states, but rather than internal settlement, it's about external policy, being the number of refugees that we're taking in and the way that things like borders are controlled and having the EU invest in those particular kinds of processes. And I'm going to weigh why this is really important throughout my speech. So first major contribution, why does the EU have an active right to be able to take control? It's going to interact with the opening opposition principle. The first thing to say is that the number of refugees that are taken in inadvertently impacts all other states. This is due to both the internal free movement of people that exists within the EU, particularly within the Schengen zone, but also that even if there is no no free movement, as I already framed, the EU resettlement scheme, which kind of compels other states to already take in refugees under the status quo, means that the individual choice of a border state to accept X number of refugees is going to impact all other states' economies. It's going to impact all other states' political decision-making as well. The second thing to say here is that the borders of EU, borders of countries who are at the outskirts of the EU are basically just borders of every single EU member state. I think that the EU basically just functions as a very, very large country under the status quo rather than a union. And these are for reasons that I think opening opposition broadly concedes. Given that so much supranational control is invested within EU institutions rather than within domestic governments when it comes to things like technocratic institutions like the European Council or things like the ECJ that aim to limit forms of national sovereignty, I think that the borders of the EU are a much more defining factor than the borders of individual states. What that means is that I think that all individual countries should have the right and should have the capacity to impact how their external border, which is morally significant because it's what basically houses the institution that coerced them as well, to determine how that border is ultimately going to be exercised. I think that our principle is better than opening governments one because they are largely about a reciprocal obligation to be able to help particular states on the border. Not only do I think that our principle applies to a larger number of people when it's all countries, our framing does not knife OG, but it also implicitly mitigates the value of their contribution when there's already some help that is being given under the status quo. I think that therefore ours is a far more positive defense. The second main contribution is that we're going to make is that increasing policy control is something that's very important. I just want to be very clear about what we think is going to happen on CG. I think that the numbers of refugees is actually probably going to increase for reasons that I'm going to articulate later. But even if it doesn't, we're planning on maximizing numbers or at least keeping them the same, but also maximizing control over how these inflows of refugees are going to look. The problem right now is that there are very, very weird fluctuations of how many refugees are being accepted at particular points in time that are disconnected from things like economic realities that actually exist in the vast majority of states. This is for two structural reasons. Firstly, the influx of refugees tend to be the most high when border states are the most economically weak. The reason for this is, as I've done in the framing at the top of my speech, due to the EU resettlement scheme that already exists, states who are on borders, as we agree with OG that's still unfair of them, have to deal with the costs of accepting refugees in the sense that they currently need to house the money to deal with their borders, which is often quite expensive to hire things like the Coast Guards and the resources to take these people in, but they do not have to deal with the responsibility of that in the sense of housing refugees, because due to things like resettlement schemes that tend to exist a lot more broadly, those refugees end up just going a lot more to other states. What this then means is that when there are often forms of economic downturns in countries like Greece, the most rational thing for them to do is at these particular junctures, more refugees actually end up coming in, because then you end up spending less money on forms of control over borders. And it doesn't really matter that more people are coming in when that burden is being outsourced to other states within the EU anyways. What this means is that actually during times of economic crisis or when there's huge downturns, they end up getting too many people going into these states because they have the least capacity to actually invest in monetary resources. The second thing to say about why lack of control ends up happening right now is that it doesn't account for when all countries holistically within the EU are actually best positioned to have some kind of absorption capacity. So even if you do not buy the first thing, like Greece, I think the problem is that only the interest of border states over when they want to accept refugees gets prioritized. So even if they have the economic capacity to house them at a particular point, the problem is that you do not know when other states under resettlement obligations are going to be able to house those particular kinds of refugees and deal with them. I think that under our side of the house, we're comparatively better because when this is being done by EU institutions, this is a better way to aggregate the preferences of a larger number of states over when they actually have absorption capacity, when they have a greater input over things like decision making at the end of the day, especially when we're probably going to get bureaucratic agencies under our side of the house being set up, who are probably going to be tasked with doing analytical assessments over when absorption is actually something that can happen. What then is the significance of basically everything that I've told you here? Firstly, we better balance the obligations of states to care about their own citizens and also the obligations to take in and care about refugees. I think it's bad to accept a bunch of refugees, and this is going to be at a trade-off with your country's own welfare system, and other people are going to die. Secondly, and importantly, because this is also going to beat off-bench, this is really crucial. This is a way to reduce long-term forms of backlash over refugee inflows. I think that a large reason about why there's anti-refugee sentiment is that we're accepting refugees when we are least able to actually deal with them under the status quo, which is when you do see things like refugees entering the employment market at the expense of other people. That's when you do see things like refugees depressing wages and cuts to your own social welfare because you have to invest in things like refugee resettlement programs. When we're accepting refugees in a way that coincides with when you have the best capacity to absorb them, overall outcomes of that are likely to be better, which is a clear way that we reduce long-term populism. Before I continue, I'll engage with OO.
Problem with your case is that it assumes the perfect aggregation of decision making, which is kind of naive in the EU. Again, why can't all your harms be solved with just giving some more redistributed funding?
So firstly, you can't fiat that. So this House believes that motion, but also like status quo is we are trying to help them settle people. I think that our case just like still kind of applies until it's able to outframe that. So I think that not only do you reduce long-term anti-refugee sentiment in that regard, I think that finally, even in their best case scenario, where Gov or op-ed proves that we accept fewer people, the quality of individual lives of refugees also improves when you're not all being accepted at once and you're going to like vastly overcrowded refugee camps, but we're able to accept you and we actually have the capacity to like house you in better ways. Finally, a brief weighing in on the populism clash. I think on top of it's unclear whether like OO's thing of like angry at the EU or the OG thing of people in border states are going to complain is more important. I think that the way that we break this is that even if populism is going to happen under either side of the house, we prefer a world where you scapegoat that blame to the EU over having bad refugee policy rather than scapegoating that blame to individual parties who are tasked with housing that refugees. The reason for this is that firstly, this is a larger tipping point of fueling domestic forms of populism because due to huge racism, fewer refugees is blown up and they're often framed as harming economic issues as well. I mean this does actually impact the policies that we elect. Whereas on the counterfactual, when it comes to the EU, due to a lot of institutions are like more technocratic, and there's a bunch of other reasons for anti-EU sentiment, this often impacts like policy and stuff a lot less. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in CG.
Great. I thank that speaker for that speech. And to open up the closing opposition case, I call upon the member of the opposition. Here.
Cool. Could I please check that I'm audible?
Yep, clearly.
Okay, let me just get my timer up. Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. I think it's extremely important to note that refugees are going to arrive to some extent on either side because the methods by which they access countries like Greece and Italy is through illegal sea crossing. What the status quo is, and I'm being very clear, is that nations like Germany tell them to get fucked, they're not accepting any refugees, and they have to deal with the influx that are coming into them. Now, what is specifically able to happen is that Italy and Greece are able to tell Germany that as a consequence of this policy, they have to shoulder some of this blame. There is two important reasons as to why this framing is going to weigh out over opening opposition. The first is that all of opening opposition's material regarding Euroscepticism is non-comparative if refugees happen on either side, given that the way in which people encounter this is likely as a consequence of reading media reports. I don't think the actual net number affects refugee perception that much because the media is able to sensationalize any amount of it. This also deals with closing government's response regarding the perception of refugees and the entry to the populism clash because it is not contingent on facts, but rather the media spin that is able to be applied. But secondarily, recognize that opening opposition do mention that there is going to be some degree of fear from Germany because they can have an influx of refugees. The problem with opening opposition's case is that they have never provided any reasons as to why Greece and Italy are able to wield any degree of power over Germany, why Germany will listen. I'm going to provide 9-ish reasons later on in this speech as to why that's something that is going to happen. Therefore, what I think is comparative in this debate is going to be the responses from Germany that they are going to be coerced into, and the ability for us to, unlike opening opposition, prove our counterfactual rather than just saying fiat. Why are we able to get the counterfactual clashing with opening government's response as to why we are able to access funding? The actual reason is that because Greece and Italy are members of the Eurozone and both have huge amounts of debts that they owe to Germany, Germany specifically have an incentive to keep them afloat so that they do not default on all of the debts and Germany lose all of their money. This means that on either side, they are going to be providing some degree of funding to prevent this. The comparative is now that they can also be coerced into taking refugees, meaning that not only do they have to give this funding, but they have to also take refugees. There are broadly 3 reasons as to why they are not going to want them beyond opening opposition's mechanisms so that we are not reliant on them. The first is that there is specifically right-wing presence rising within Europe. Opening oppositions say right-wing, but don't ever prove the power in which they are able to exhibit. This manifests in 2 ways. First of all, votes within the European Parliament. Secondly, the growing domestic right-wing movements within a majority of these states. Why has this happened? With 2 additional mechanisms. The post-COVID recession fear is particularly important insofar as this also deals with closing government's case. Europe is a very different place than it was in 2016 whenever the EU resettlement scheme was made. As a consequence of this, the specific specific fear that countries now are going to have to go through a massive recession when trying to move back from COVID means that they are not going to be willing to take these risks. But thirdly, recognize that the social unrest that the media have reported about that has occurred as a consequence of influx of refugees means that the domestic appetite for this, even in the most liberal of states like France and Germany, means that there is no fucking domestic appetite anywhere for an influx of refugees. Opening government provides some mechanization as to why there might be. They say firstly that you want an increased labor force. Given that these people are often arriving both unskilled and unable to speak the language, they are never perceived as a labor force, so this incentive isn't met. Secondarily, they say that it is good PR. Good PR to whom? I have no fucking idea why the people who you want to appease, aka the growing right wing within it, or just the people who want to maintain their job in the post-COVID recession are going to be into this. Thirdly, risks to bailout. I've already proven why this is symmetric. Fourthly, socialization of minority groups. Sure, maybe this applies to the leaders of the countries. I don't think this necessarily applies to the people on the ground, insofar as one, often the way in which they encounter it is by media, which highly sensationalizes these stories to sell as many papers as possible. But secondarily, I don't think they necessarily vote for their own interests all of the time. I think this is something that opening government haven't proven, and therefore what I have proven is that the states who would be able to take these and give them some sort of enriching life are not going to do it. Let's deal with closing government's EU resettlement scheme, because it exists, but it is shit. Ireland's quota is literally 15 people, and closing government have only provided a fact-based claim and not done any characterization as to what the settlement scheme looks like. How you should then adjudicate this back half clash is two ways. Firstly, the specific reason why they did this is because there was pressure on them to do something, and they did this as an act of symbolism to make it look like they were doing something, knowing that nobody was going to fucking bother reading the fried print. But secondly, as I've already alluded to, the EU was a very different place back then, and the specific new context of the social unrest that occurred in nations like Germany and the specific context of COVID means that the appetite that did exist then has diminished even further, meaning there is no incentive anywhere in the fucking EU for these refugees to go anywhere. What is then going to occur as a consequence of this? What is going to occur is that Germany are going to backlash to a great extent, and they are going to do things like, one, put coast guards on the sea borders that literally push people out so they are no longer in EU waters and fucking leave them to drown. Two, I think they are going to put standards like policing, whereby there are literal squads of people going around the streets trying to catch refugees and send them back, because the problem was, now it was Italy and Greece's problem, so all they had to do was slide them a bit of money. Now when they are able to pressure Germany into taking them, specifically they have a direct incentive to, one, patrol the waters, two, patrol the streets, and three, remove all of the incentives that they would be able to access so that it is no longer incentivizing for them to come here. How are Italy and Greece able to actually pressure them? 9 reasons. 1, the European Parliament. 2, they have the ability to pull out at the point at which this is bad because pulling out of the Eurozone collapses on all of their debt. Germany don't fucking want that. 3, they don't want to run the risk of an anti-EU party coming into power in these states. 4thly, they want their debts to end up being paid back. 5thly, nations like Greece and Italy are flirting with China as a comparative, and as a consequence, there is another competitor that is getting in there. 6thly, at the point at which Italy is a founding member, there is symbolism that you have to protect them, and they are able to leverage a lot of that with regards to the European Parliament. 7thly, there is a shared currency, so you don't want to fuck them up. 8thly, at the point at which they are specifically able to do things like leverage the fact that these people are going to be like ill in a post-COVID context, particularly with the strained health system that nations like Greece and Italy have. Specifically, there is too big of a risk for Germany to not just send patrols out to the waters and the street and prevent these people ever arriving. I think this is awful for all of the reasons the opening government themselves provide, because refugee camps are terrible, and now they're going to get even worse when you want to make the maximum incentive of these people not coming here. CO.
Great, I thank that speaker for that speech, and to close go upon the opposition with here. Yep, very clearly.
Look, I think Jess did a really good job of explaining Europe's racism through analysing it to Australian racism and their border control. The problem is there, the kind of misunderstanding, which is what Jason brings you into this debate, of the context of the European Union. And unfortunately for both proposition teams as well, that is a kind of a problem for them in this debate, when in particular CG is based off a misunderstanding of the laws and rules of the European Union and this specific situation that Jason outlined. And they said there was no response. Okay, yes, Jason mightn't have done the novice thing of flagging the specific response, but given his entire case, it was directly beating your case and engaging with the reality that you posed by posing a separate and competing reality. That is engagement. But I will take you for a POI later, so do prepare one, and please turn your screen on for it because it helps me. Thank you. Okay, I want to talk to you about a couple of things. The second is getting the best situation for refugees, or at least a more amicable situation for refugees. But first of all, I want to talk to you about the CG principle, because I just want to take it out of the debate. A couple of things on it. The principle is based on a flawed foundation. The first of which is to say, like in the first speaker's point, that it's essentially like a country. Like, I could give you 1,000 reasons why the EU is essentially not like a country, but I'll do like 10 really quickly. 1, very different laws. 2, very different tax laws. 3, very different policing policies, different industries, different military policies. Some countries do have militaries, some countries hate militaries. People have very different histories, very different identities. Some countries within Europe colonized other countries within Europe, and therefore there isn't a shared identity or a shared community or a shared country, and therefore there isn't a feeling that you have an exact right over the borders of your entire continent, but that it is a shared economic union that has some social ties and some social connections, right? But anyway, they then say that, so that's the first one, that's like one country. But then the second reason prong of this principle is that it affects all. Now, yes, they are able to say that in some way, immigrants coming in to Greece impact Spain. A couple of things on this. The main prong of their analysis here is the freedom of movement within the European Union. Like, panel, freedom of movement within the European Union is for European citizens to go to other European countries. That is why you show your European passport. All our passports look very similar to one another and we can get in. But yes, that is a fact-based claim. The average reasonable informed voter within Europe knows that. I understand, Chair, you're not from Europe, but I hope maybe you've seen a passport at some point. But even if you haven't, some logical analysis that backs that up, right? I think that given the Spain point that the closing government makes, here's the logical reason as to why what I just said is correct. The principle they try to claim in closing government is that if you are impacted by something at all, you then have equal say over the border. Now note, Spain might be marginally impacted by immigrants coming into Greece, but a lot fucking less so than the people of Greece, right? And the people who have to deal with it on a day-by-day basis. And what does this mean? It means Spain, or any other European country for that matter, may have the right to do something to mitigate the impact, but not to the equal level of Greece. So they have the right to mitigate the influx of migrants coming into their countries, possibly by having safeguards within the freedom of movement policy within the EU of not allowing refugees to move freely between countries. There, I've done the logic to the rule that I think is a fact, but I've done the little loop for you. So on either end, I think I've dealt with it. Now, the final claim to deal with in CG, but I think it's gone now because I've taken out the 2 prongs. But even if I haven't, and you think their principle exists, they say that that's good because in the end, it kind of, the refugee flow is controlled on their side of the debate. Jason gives you 9 reasons as to why on our side of the debate, the refugee flow to wider Europe is controlled through funding, through engagement, and through appealing to other countries to solve the health and policing issues that exist within countries such as Greece and Italy. Let me talk you through them. Okay, sorry, lots of lists in this speech. I think that the issue again with Jess is opening opposition. I shouldn't just say Jess. The issue with opening opposition is that I love Jess. She's great. The issue with opening opposition is that they again don't understand the mechanisms for which that funding that they kind of rest their claim on to solving the problem actually occurs, right? It is legitimate therefore for both proposition teams to go, I don't know why you have the fiat to say that money goes there, because Jess says her fiat is a part of equal political will, right? The problem is that's not analysis, right? Because there's different political wills for funding than there is for having people coming into your borders and maybe sending out a boat, and you have to analyze where those wills come from. And I think Jason does that and thus solves that major clash within the debate. How does he do that, right? Status quo countries such as Greece, Italy, etc., the countries that are dealing with the problems, they are able to do a couple of things, right? I think it's just really important to note that these countries have a shared currency with the biggest players in Europe, right? At the point where Italy goes bankrupt because they cannot deal with their fledgling healthcare system, they cannot deal with their population overcrowding, they cannot deal with it. That is when Germany steps in. Because, and I will start to engage with OG in a moment, but actually, no, I'll do it now. So OG says the reason EU people will like this is threefold. One, they're quite educated. Two, there's a stigma against racism. And three, a lot of centrist governments exist. Jason takes this out of the debate. Why so? Possibly true 10 years ago, but unfortunately in a post-COVID world, in a post-COVID scenario, there is a desperate fear that for the second time in my adult lifetime, we are going to be in a major recession. What does that mean? It means we start voting more fiscally responsibly. And what does fiscally responsibly mean? It means a little bit more right-wing. Actually, OG, sorry, we didn't engage with you, so go.
Yes, EU countries will have to pay for the countries no matter what, which is why the incentives you identify about harsher crackdowns are not exclusive. Instead, we need the GovS policy, which is an extension of the distribution of resources so that Germany doesn't pay for it alone.
No, it's not just Germany alone. It's the entire Eurozone, which is 14 countries. But anyway, like whatever, I'm not going to go into that. Why is it not symmetric on your side of the debate? Jason explains to you that on our side of the debate, people get into Italy, they get into Greece, because they're going to come on both sides of this debate, right? Through desperation, through sorry, you're out of time now. Through desperation, I'm sorry, I said sorry. Through desperation, through problems, right? I think at that point, right? Sorry, that threw me a sec. I think at that point, it's not symmetric. Why is it not symmetric? Status quo, Germany is able to use some of the stuff that opening government talks about, of appeasing certain opinions, of doing nice things because they can fiscally afford to do so, but they're able to mitigate it through keeping the problem maintained within Italy. At the point where opening government wants to take too much control away from countries organizing their own borders, the reality of that situation is not this, we fund and we protect Italy. It's that we fund and we protect our own populations, and we fuel the problem within Europe of not controlling populism, of not controlling the issues there, but rather having boats on the borders, stopping people coming in and making it a lot harder for people to access wider Europe. All you do is inflate the problem, probably result in more death. Opening up government wanted to save more refugees, they failed to do so. I think it's an off bench, maybe a back half, I don't know, but I think we're through. Thanks.
I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I thank all speakers for what was a great debate. I invite all speakers to virtually cross the floor, shake hands, and then exit the room. We will